Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us in this virtual space. It's great to be able to have this time with you all. It both seems distant and intimate all at the same time. Just to warn you, GLSEN has been working remotely for about a week now, and so in this infinite space of time where sort of day night all blur, this original presentation, very going through it. Oh my God, it's 40 minutes long. And then, it expanded as our time has expanded here at home. So hopefully I have cut it enough. Naomi, please yell at me if I'm
I'd be happy to
running out of time. Yes. Hi, everyone. So Joe Kosciw, I am the director of the GLSEN Research Institute. I'll be talking about LGBT student experiences across Eastern Europe, specifically looking at comparisons from 6 national school climate studies. GLSEN, if you're not familiar, is a US-based national education organization that's focused on ensuring safe schools for all students. We do that through research, education resources and training, our student leadership, policy work in our DC office, and public awareness campaigns. And we have local chapters across the country who are really doing the tough work in schools on the ground. The Research Institute, so GLSEN's been around for about 30 years. And for 20 of those 30 years almost, the research has been, I believe, a core part of GLSEN and GLSEN psyche and operations, in that we're supporting the organization's mission by conducting original research on SOGI issues in education, K through 12 education specifically. And the nature of that, and I raise this because it's relevant for, I think, what we were doing with countries across the world, is that at the time when GLSEN was a young organization, there was nearly no information about the experiences of LGBT students in secondary school. And given that, in order to do advocacy and to really demonstrate this is what's going on and this is why changes need to be made in schools and school districts and at the national and state level, we had to collect our own data, and thus birthed the GLSEN Research Institute, although the name is new, but the concept of GLSEN Research has been around for 20 years. So in that, we've been doing this sort of documenting, we've been doing a biennial survey of LGBT, now LGBTQ secondary school students since 1999. Us and most of the literature and most of the research on this population of youth and looking at schools has come from the US, but also emerging from other countries such as Israel has been doing this for years, the UK and Australia. And so part of our purpose is to sort of broaden that database, that knowledge base globally. But what we do know from the US populations and from other countries is that universally, LGBT youth face a hostile school climate in which they experience high levels of verbal and physical harassment. And we find historically that this victimization is related to negative outcomes, both for well-being as well as for education and achievement. So as I said, we wanted to develop a global knowledge base on LGBT student experiences. So formally for the past 6-7 years, that we've been doing informally for longer, it's about sharing our best practices and our knowledge and our research abilities with NGOs across the world. So this sort of fits nicely with Hyungu's presentation, in that we are working with those organizations who say that they want to work on education and youth programs, and many of them are in the same position that GLSEN was 20 years ago, and we still are today, needing to sort of fill out and understand and demonstrate what's going on for this population of young people. And so it's sort of giving back to the global community, helping them develop the same knowledge base within their own countries for their own programming, funding, and for advocacy work. We believe that NGOs play a unique role in research, and I say that, of course, being from an NGO, that with our proximity to the population, we often have a great understanding of the knowledge of the needs of the population, thus leading to what are the questions that needs to be asked. And obviously we have access to, more direct access to the population itself. further, once that we have the knowledge base, we are often well positioned to then use the data to focus on prevention, solution, and advocacy. And I think doing this we've done this domestically with other institutions in the US, but I believe it will be helpful on a global level. It allows us to do borrowing and lending of best practices. What is working in some countries, what is working in others. We learn from each country that we have provided technical assistance for, and it informs our work here in the US. And there's some things that we have done that people have used and adapted in their other country contexts. So today I'm specifically talking about Europe, really Eastern Europe, but across Europe, we have thus far, along with our partners at Teachers College, Columbia University, have worked with with NGOs in 19 countries across the continent. And GLSEN has been primarily working in Eastern Europe and the gray boxes, and Oren and his team have been working with the organizations in Western Europe. But we worked very closely together on all of this, Columbia and GLSEN. Specifically in Eastern Europe, I'm going to be talking about the 6 countries we first worked with in 2017: Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, Romania, and Latvia. And these are the NGOs that were primary on their studies. All amazing organizations. All of them are, none of them is specific about education and youth. Education and youth is just one of many things that they do. So that is one way that GLSEN differs from these. And I think the US might differ from other countries, is that US is large. We have many LGBTQ organizations. And so we often can be very specialized and differentiated from one another. Whereas in a lot of countries, there's 1 or 2, and they are more generalists working on many issues. So as I said, today will hopefully give us a better understanding of the social factors that shape the experiences of LGBT students in schools, using these 6 Eastern European countries as our first attempt to understand this. Before going further, just want to make a note about language. I will consistently, or I will strive consistently to use LGBT in this presentation, even though in day-to-day life at GLSEN, we will typically use LGBTQ. And that is, we have found that regions change. Regions use different terms, different acronyms are salient to their populations and their estimation. So across the 6 countries, and actually the other countries we've since worked with in Eastern Europe, LGBT typically is what resonates, they believe, with their community, and especially with the youth population. So we will not use Q or I in this presentation. Now that is just Eastern Europe. I believe it's actually a little different in Western Europe. I believe the I is more common, and it is different in other regions. For example, Latin America, we've worked with 7 NGOs there, and they often will use the Q. But just to explain why I'm using LGBT. So, as I'd mentioned, each of these countries conducted their own unique national school climate survey that targeted and examined the experiences of the LGBT secondary students. In their countries, the questionnaires were developed by the NGOs, but they were based on GLSEN's National School Climate Survey that has more or less remained the same since 2001, and other countries have also adapted it prior to this work in Europe. Such as Israel, the UK, so that it allows us to be able to have some comparison across countries. We believe the questions are often, many of the questions are indeed comparable, and Oren and I in the past have published on comparisons between US and Israel. The instrument looks at feelings of safety at school, biased language, for example, homophobic and transphobic remarks, harassment and assault based on personal characteristics such as sexual orientation or gender expression. It also looks at affirmative school support. What do you have in your school that you find positive for LGBT students, such as supportive educators or inclusion in the curriculum? And then the surveys allow us all to look at how school climate relates to academic experience and engagement in education, as well as how it may relate to psychosocial well-being. And we also collect personal and school characteristics. All of this data was collected in 2017. The surveys were available online, and outreach was done through organizational contacts, uh, their email lists, relationships with other NGOs in their countries. Some actually made use of teachers' unions or other supportive institutions that they have good connections with, and also done through, but to reach sort of the broadest population possible of LGBT secondary school students, social media was used in targeted advertising on Facebook and similar products to Facebook in these countries. To look at differences across the countries, we did a series of analyses of covariance. We controlled for comparable demographics. Not all of the demographic and school characteristics were really comparable across them because of their country context, but age, I forgot to put in gender and sexual orientation. And specifically, we looked at feeling unsafe at school, anti-LGBT remarks, verbal harassment, and LGBT supports in school. We had over 6,000 in this combined study. The larger samples were from Poland and Romania. The average age was close to 17 years old. And the sample was over half cisgender female and about 44% identified as gay or lesbian, and a third as bisexual. An additional 6% as pansexual. So looking at our results and the negative indicators of school climate, first, as I said, we asked, and I say we when it was really the countries. So, so we, as the collective, we looked at the reasons why students feel unsafe at school for a variety of characteristics, and the list changed somewhat according to country, but the three consistent were, do you feel unsafe because of your sexual orientation, your gender expression, and your gender? And as you can see, that the over half of students across the 6 countries felt unsafe because of their sexual orientation. And about a third or more felt unsafe because of their gender expression, and around a tenth or less around their gender specifically. With regard to sexual orientation, you can see the green bar is Lithuania, and that was significantly higher. Students in that country were more likely to say they felt unsafe for that reason. And notably in gender expression, the middle set, Ukraine was lower than all of the others, the orange bar at the end, followed by Poland. So Ukraine and Poland were lower. And with gender, there were really no significant differences in the feelings of safety across the countries with regard to feeling unsafe about gender. And next, then we asked students a series of questions around what kind of negative remarks you hear in school, homophobic remarks. Some countries asked about racist remarks, transgender, anti-transgender remarks, and also remarks about gender expression. And what you can see, the first set of bars is the frequency of those, the means of those frequency of hearing homophobic remarks in school. This is less evident in that this shows means. You can still see the mean is close to often for many. It's between sometimes and often. And really the vast majority of students in these countries are hearing homophobic remarks and actually hearing negative remarks about gender expression as well. But with regard to homophobic remarks, you can note that the turquoise bar, second to the last, was Romania, and they were somewhat higher in their incidence of hearing homophobic remarks. With regard to negative remarks about masculinity and femininity, that question was worded something like, how often do you hear negative remarks about someone not acting masculine enough or someone not acting feminine enough? And across the two, you can see the patterns are very similar. Negative remarks about masculinity were, by and large, somewhat higher. For both, Poland and Latvia were lower, had a lower mean on those, on the incidence of those remarks, whereas Romania and Ukraine were higher than all of the others. The last set of bars is around hearing negative remarks about transgender people. We do not have that question from Lithuania, but you can again see Ukraine and Romania were higher than the rest of the countries. and Latvia was the lowest, followed by Hungary. And lastly, looking at negative indicators of school climate, we asked about verbal harassment. Are you called names and taunted with regard to your sexual orientation and your gender expression? And so the blue bar is the mean frequency of verbal harassment about sexual orientation, and the red bar around gender expression. And with regard to verbal harassment about sexual orientation, you can see across the board, Latvia and Lithuania, so the second and third blue bars were the lowest relative to the other countries. With harassment with regard to gender expression, the red bars, Ukraine, Poland, and Romania were higher than the other three countries in the frequency of verbal harassment in that regard. What's also—
check in, Joe, just 5 minutes.
Okay, all right. So what's notable about this is that for Ukraine, Lithuania, and Latvia, gender expression within the country, harassment about that was higher than it was for sexual orientation. So just briefly about school supports, we asked how many teachers you have in your school who are supported, teachers, school officials who are supportive of LGBT students. As you can see, it was relatively, most people have had someone, in most of the countries had one or more, but not many teachers. And with in this chart, again, Poland asked a different question. They asked about degree of supportiveness, but as you can see in this question, Ukraine, students in Ukraine reported the fewer number of teachers. And with regard to being taught LGBT content in the curriculum, so we're actually looking at negative and positive content. So the blue bar is positive content, and you can see it's pretty low across all of the countries. Most students are not being taught anything positive about LGBT people, history, and events. That is actually true in the United States as well. The Ukraine and Poland, curiously, were somewhat higher in that. With negative, being taught negative, you can see that is much higher. You can also see the stark difference in countries such as Lithuania and Ukraine, where they're much more likely to hear negative remarks than positive remarks. Certain countries like Poland, they're really not hearing a lot about either. They're not hearing a lot of negative, they're not hearing a lot of positive. So quickly with our discussion, just to say with our limitations, these are not generalizable to all of Eastern Europe or even Europe. It's really just about LGBT students who identified as such, so missing people who may later identify or experiencing same-sex attraction, but do not identify in that way. And there could be sampling differences across countries. They all had different, some similar techniques, but different relationships with the youth populations in their countries. And there could always be, the always existential question is, do the questions really mean the same thing across countries? We think they do. Everyone thinks they do, but do they really resonate in the same way from country to country once sort of in the way that they're worded and how they are received by the people? So overall, we found that there are problems, huge problems with anti-LGBT name calling and harassment across the 6 countries. So that is consistent with what we're finding in other countries in the world, and certainly what we find in the United States. Just a couple of interesting things that popped up for me in the data. Students in Ukraine were less likely to report feeling unsafe, but they reported higher levels of verbal harassment, especially related to gender expression. And in contrast, students in Lithuania were more likely to say, I feel unsafe in my school, but they had lower incidence of negative remarks and harassment. So I think this brings up the point of there's the actuality of the event, or at least as it is reported by students, which may vary culturally, how much do you feel you can report on this, but also in how much one will identify that this affects you in any way. So they may not feel unsafe, but they're experiencing it a lot, or vice versa. So I think it's something interesting to explore as we continue. And another pattern was around gender and policing of gender behaviors. Curious that in Ukraine and Romania, they were consistent in that they had the highest negative remarks about around gender expression regarding femininity, and in anti-transgender remarks, and on harassment regarding gender expression greater than around sexual orientation. So I think as we fill out the map in Eastern Europe and in Europe and look more at comparative differences, we might have a greater understanding of what that is, but it seems like gender and policing of gender behaviors it might be more common in those 2 countries. One commonality to throw out of the six, those are the two that are primarily Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox countries. And this will also be interesting if these countries continue and do further follow-up research, because there's a burgeoning, there has been since we've collected this data, anti-gender ideology movement that has been growing across Europe as it has in other regions. So with that, I imagine, I see my chat box, probably Naomi telling me I'm out of time. Just to say, with regard to supports, few students have them. But those that do, we have also found that, which I didn't get into, that they report greater benefit when they do have them. So I think my final comment will be, it's important to work with NGOs for them to use this data to advocate for these supports to be in their school, because we're seeing that, as in other regions, the incidence of anti-LGBT behaviors and events in school is quite high and astonishingly high, even as there are differences within the region across countries. So thank you. See, all these are script. We move to questions. That is me. If you would like to know more information, please feel free to contact me.